In this lesson, we'll create a line and wash image by combining pen and ink applications with watercolor washes. Hello everyone, Matt here with thevirtualinstructor.com, and in this lesson we're going to combine the best characteristics of pen and ink drawing with the best characteristics of watercolor painting. With the pen and ink we can define the edges of our subject, we can also add a bit of texture and value, and then with the watercolor applications we can add splashes of color and get that looser look that's going to complement the pen and ink drawing that's a little bit more rigid and tight. We'll be working on Canson hot press watercolor paper. This paper is smooth enough to create some nice line work with the pen and ink, but it will accept the watercolor applications with ease. We're also going to be using Staedtler or Staedtler technical drawing pens, and specifically I'm going to be using one pen for this demonstration. I'll be using a 0.02 millimeter pen to apply the line work. I'm also going to be using Grumbacher Golden Edge nylon brushes. I'll be using two of these sizes of brushes. I'll be using the number 14 and the 00. Both of these are round brushes. And then for the watercolor applications, we'll be working with Cotman watercolor paints, and I'll be using the tube paints for this application. So let's go ahead and get started. We'll begin by creating a light sketch, and first we'll define the horizon line, or basically the line where the water meets the sky. Then we can start filling in the basic shapes of the forms that we see within the scene, starting with the lighthouse. Now you might be tempted to place the lighthouse right in the center of the picture plane, but we're going to offset it just slightly to the right to make the composition a little bit more interesting. We're also going to leave out details or any shading or value applications with this graphite sketch. Instead, we're going to focus on only the shapes and the contours or the outlines of the subject. We're also not going to fill in all of the details. You'll see here we're going to fill in most of the details with the pen and ink applications. We're starting with an H graphite pencil here because we don't want the pencil lines to be evident in the finished drawing. In fact, after we apply the pen and ink, we'll go back and erase the pencil lines, but we want them to be dark enough so that we can see them to apply the pen and ink over the top. You'll also notice that our marks are rather loose. We're drawing quickly and again, not becoming too concerned with the details that we see. Now that we've got our basic sketch in place, we can start with the pen and ink applications. And pen and ink relies heavily on the use of line, so we'll be using line to develop the textures as well as the details, and also to define the edges through our contour lines. And that's where we'll start. We'll start with the contour lines, and as we go, we'll start to fill in some of the values. But keep in mind that many of our values in our dark areas and light areas are going to be determined by the watercolor applications. You can always go back with pen and ink applications after you've made the watercolor applications. The key here is not to get too dark with our pen and ink applications, since the watercolor will affect the value and tone of the finished image. At the very top of the lighthouse, we do have some very dark areas. In fact, most people would consider this area to be black. We're not going to fill it in completely solid black, but we can go ahead and use some hatching here to develop some of the tone. Then we'll continue working our way down. There are a couple of pieces that kind of stick out on the top part of the lighthouse, so we'll define those. We'll also define the window that's slightly to the left of center of the lighthouse, and also the outer contours. Since our light source is originating from the right side in this image, most of our darker values will exist on the left side of the subjects. And as we define the outer contours of some of these subjects, you'll notice that I'll use a broken line on the side that's closest to the light source. This will help create the illusion of light in a subtle way. Then we can simply continue working our way down to the buildings, again starting with the contour lines and then filling in some of the details. We'll also add an indication of shadow underneath each of the areas that overhang underneath the roof. We're accomplishing this with just some simple hatching. There are a couple of areas where some of the bushes and trees overlap the lines for the buildings, so we'll need to make sure that we address that as we go so we don't have to overlap them later in the drawing process. We'll continue darkening in some of the areas, especially on the left side of each one of the buildings. These darker locations exist mainly in the areas of the windows, and we'll stick with hatching for this. Now, in pen and ink drawing, you typically want to stick with a pen and ink application technique. In other words, if we start with stippling, we typically would want to end with stippling. In this case, we're going to use a variety of different marks, but for the buildings, we're going to stick with hatching and not do any cross hatching. You could, of course, do some cross hatching, but we want to stay consistent with our applications. Now, as we work our way down to some of the rocks and some of the bushes and trees that are growing out of the rocks, we're going to change our application technique. For the rocks, we'll stick with straighter lines and more angular marks. For the bushes and the trees, however, we'll allow our marks to be a bit more free-form and then concentrate those marks in the areas of darkest value. This will create contrast using line alone. So we'll have contrast between the bushes and the trees, the rocks, and the houses and the lighthouse because we've used lines slightly different in each one of these locations. Now you'll notice as we begin the process of developing some of the textures down here, we're also addressing some of the values as well. Now, just as we did on the buildings and the lighthouse, we want to make sure that we don't get too dark with our values at this point, since we're going to go back and apply watercolor washes later. Again, I'll remind you that you can always go back with the pen and ink applications over the top of the watercolor washes if you need to make some of the values darker. You may also notice that I'm not allowing myself to become too overwhelmed with the details. Instead, I'm allowing the lines that I put on the surface to do a lot of the work for me. There's something to be said about a drawing that insinuates some of the details rather than describing them completely. While looking at a subject like this and seeing all the details can be quite overwhelming, it doesn't have to be. Just allow the line work that you create in your drawing to do some of the hard work for you. Instead of allowing yourself to get distracted by every single detail that you see, instead look at the basic shape of the subject that you're drawing. This could be a rock or a bush, and then try to simplify that subject down into basic lines. Now, of course, we're all going to simplify this information differently, and the way that you simplify it is unique to you, so embrace that. But allow your marks to be a little bit loose and don't let yourself get too stiff with the drawing by being overwhelmed by all the details that you see. Now, since this cliff is on the opposite side of the light source, there is a greater concentration of darker values. You may notice this here in the drawing. So I'm allowing some of these darker values to be developed, again with hatching. These lines that are added by hatching are determined by the form of the rock. You'll notice that most of these lines are diagonal in nature. With the rock face complete, we'll draw a broken line for the horizon line using a ruler. Then we'll add our final details to the fence that meanders its way along the top of the cliff. We'll allow the ink applications to dry completely, then we'll erase any remaining graphite marks using a kneaded eraser. Now we're ready for our watercolor applications. We'll start with an application of pure water in the area of the sky and down into the area of the water. We'll use this application of water to control our subsequent applications of watercolor. So we want to make sure that this application of water doesn't overlap the lighthouse, the buildings, the rocks, or the bushes and trees. We want to make sure it's just applied to the sky and the water. Then, using an application of ultramarine with just a touch of burnt umber to tone it down a bit, we'll apply a bit of watercolor in the areas that we applied the water. We can work it around with the brush, leaving a few areas a little bit lighter in tone and value to indicate a few clouds. Because we applied water to the surface first and we're applying the wet watercolor into it, we'll get a light airy effect. Close to the horizon line, we'll introduce just a touch of Prussian blue to the mix to add a bit of variety. Now, while this section dries, we'll work a bit on the rock face. We'll start with an application of burnt sienna with just a touch of burnt umber. Then we can start to develop some of the shadows. We'll use a mixture of Prussian blue with burnt umber and a touch of burnt sienna. This will create a warmer gray, but it will contrast the burnt sienna nicely. We'll work while the burnt sienna applications are still wet, allowing some bleeding to occur. Now, many of our buildings are white, but instead of leaving them white, we'll add just a bit of color to them to add a bit of volume and form. We'll start with the lighthouse with a very light application of ultramarine, primarily on the side of the lighthouse in shadow. We'll do the same to the white buildings underneath. With watercolor painting, we want to rely on the white of the paper to lighten the values that we apply, so we'll allow some broken marks in areas to insinuate some highlights. We'll fill in the color of the roofs using a mixture of burnt umber, burnt sienna, a touch of alizarin crimson, and a touch of cadmium red. Here again, we'll leave some broken marks to insinuate highlights, especially on the sides of the roof that face the light source. We do have a lone brick building within the scene, so we'll apply the same color to it. We can then darken some of the roofs that are on the opposite side of the light source with an application of burnt umber. We'll also darken the value of the lone brick building again with this application of burnt umber. Now we can go in and develop some of the shadows that happen on the buildings. We'll use a combination of burnt umber and Prussian blue. In this case, our mixture is dominated by Prussian blue to give it a little bit more of a cooler appearance. It's actually more of a gray that is created when we mix these two colors. We'll also apply this color to the darkest areas of the lighthouse. Now we're ready to start addressing some of the colors of the trees and bushes underneath. We'll use a mixture of cadmium yellow mixed with a bit of ultramarine to create a green. We'll apply this color initially to the areas of shadow. Then we can go back and make the shadowed areas a little bit stronger by allowing our mixture to be dominated with the ultramarine. This will create a cooler appearance. Then with a mixture that's dominated with our yellow, we'll go back and address some of the highlights on the top portions of the bushes. Now we can make our shadows a bit stronger and increase the contrast within the image. We'll start in the areas of the rocks. Again, we'll use a mixture of Prussian blue and burnt umber. We'll allow this mixture to be a bit stronger when we apply it to the surface, meaning we'll use slightly less water. Of course, we'll apply this application in the areas of shadow only, and primarily in the areas where the shadow is the strongest. We can go back and strengthen the shadow on the houses, again increasing the contrast and further creating the illusion of the light source. We'll also address the darkest areas on the lighthouse. Next, we'll need to apply a mid-tone value to the rocks and a color that will help to unify all the rocks as well. So we'll use our mixture of green that we used earlier for the bushes and add a touch of burnt umber and just a bit of Prussian blue. We'll also bring out some of the oranges a bit in the rocks by applying an additional application of burnt sienna in selected areas. We'll go back to our green mixture and add a grassy patch in front of one of the buildings. The color of the trim painted on the buildings is a blue-green, so we'll use our green mixture but add a bit more of the ultramarine and a touch of Prussian blue to create a darker blue-green. We'll apply this with a smaller brush. Now we'll go back to the top of the lighthouse and use a mixture of burnt umber and Prussian blue. This time the application is very dark and very intense with very little water used. We'll use a bit of our cadmium yellow and add a bit of light coming from the lighthouse. Then we'll apply a bit of water over the top and dab it with a paper towel to create a proper illusion of light. Now we'll add a few ripples to the water using a darker mixture of ultramarine, a touch of Prussian blue, and just a touch of burnt umber. We'll use the smaller brush for this and create horizontal strokes. We'll allow these applications to get lighter as they go away from the viewer. We'll use this same color just above the horizon line to create some variety and added interest. Then, using just a touch of water, we can soften the contrast of these marks. And now our line and wash image of a lighthouse using pen and ink and watercolor is complete. If you enjoyed this video, then I know that you'll enjoy being a member at thevirtualinstructor.com. Our comprehensive membership program includes video courses on drawing and painting, weekly live lessons, ebooks, lesson plans for teachers, weekly critiques, and much, much more. To learn more about our program, just visit thevirtualinstructor.com/members or click on the card in the upper right-hand corner. And if you want to check out 3 of our course modules for free, you can do so. Just click on the link on your screen now. And if you're watching this on YouTube, make sure that you subscribe to the channel. I look forward to seeing you in the next video.